Hello everybody, this is Fun Police, and we are back with a new deck tech today. I want to apologize for the bit of silence in terms of the upload schedule. Some things happened and it threw off everything, but hopefully things are getting back to normal for me so we can keep doing deck techs and various other things. For today though, I wanted to tackle a deck that I've always had a lot of fun with, and that is a German Alpine list. Ever since Alpine came out, I've always been a fan of it. Even though it's never been meta-defining, it's always been a deck that is functional, at least for the during most times. But I think that definitely with the introduction of Legions a while ago, this deck has found new life and is definitely much more functional overall. It can reasonably win games, and especially due to the current meta, it's definitely not as under it's not under as much pressure as it has been in other metas. Uh, Notably, Soviet artillery has decreased a lot in play, which was one of the hardest decks to fight against. Because if they could very quickly dominate the board and not allow you to build your Alpine up. Many decks are either a lot slower now, or if they are aggressive, at least are trading into your own units, and that's where this kind of spin on Alpine in this list is going to benefit us. Uh, so Alpine is, in general, an aggressive beatdown deck. You are essentially using the keyword Alpine, which is essentially if you play an Alpine unit and you have other Alpine units on the board, it gets +1/+1 for each other Alpine. So if I play a third Alpini regiment and I have one on the board already, then it would get +2, or it would be a 2/3 instead of a 1/2. So as you play more of them and the more they're on the board, the more insane they get. It doesn't take a lot for Alpine to really get going. Units get very big very quickly. And that is the game plan, essentially. So let's just talk about the cards real quick. So 3rd Alpini Regiment is the vanilla Alpine unit. It is probably the most important Alpine unit, as it is a 1-drop Alpine, which allows you to, right from the start of the game, get your Alpine chain going. And that is very useful because it allows you to play big units, onwards on turn 2, on turn 3, on turn 4, and you can essentially curve out very smoothly. And if decks don't quickly respond to you or take over the board themselves, they can be facing some really tough opposition. So definitely like one of the most important Alpine cards. But then we move on to Joint Operation. And Joint Operation is a card that will seem a bit weird because we only really run a mix of infantry and tanks alongside a small handful of fighters, but I promise you that it is a really solid card even with just those. If you control a tank and an infantry, this is 2 credits, deal 3 damage to a unit, which is from the people that cost 1 less. And that's really nice. Like, that is still just really solid removal and is enough to often deal with most of the problematic units, such as like a bomber or an artillery piece that is keeping you back. So Joint Operation, definitely, we're not getting the ridiculous like 4 to 5 damage often. There's very rare occasions we can do that, but just 2 credits to deal 3 damage is a good baseline, and it's not hard for this deck to reach that threshold. Especially on top of that, it being so cheap means it's not hard to fit this into turns where you play down, like another tank and then Joint Operation, and then if you have an infantry already on the board, which this deck is flooding with infantry, you should almost always have something on the board. It allows Joint Operation to almost always be, the 2 credit deal 3 damage, which is good. It's just good removal, and it is the most flexible of the removals. Other cards such as Sudden Strike or Tactical Strike are good removals also, and you could definitely consider swapping them if your meta is maybe a bit aimed towards a certain archetype. Like if you're facing a lot of aggro, then it probably is better to use like a sudden strike, but we'll explain why I'm not including those. But in general, I find joint operation is the most universally flexible option among the various removal tools. Because this deck is very good, it just needs a little bit of removal. It doesn't need like really strong removal options, because it just needs enough to remove maybe one or two problematic threats and then just give itself a little room to get going. Because once Alpine spins up, it is very hard to stop. So beyond that, we also have the Panzer 35T. This is just a bog standard German aggro card. Notably, this is very easy to put into the deck because 3rd Alpini curves into it, giving you a good turn 1 into turn 2, you know, and it makes it so you have a very smooth game, and you have a very smooth early game, you know, and you can even get some pressure in. It's also good just because it's cheap burst damage, you know. 2 credits to deal 2 to the enemy HQ, or, you know, occasionally use it to help trade into some big unit that you gotta kill. It's overall just a really good card, you know. If you play Germany at all, you understand the power of the 35T. It's a good card. Then we move on to the 141st Gibrix Jaeger. This is probably one of the biggest Alpine cards there is. It is a 2 credit 3/2 with Alpine. And it cannot be targeted by enemy orders. And this is massive. This is one of the best Alpine cards, and it, because of its ability to be immune to orders. This makes it really useful because it becomes really hard to kill if you have even just a few other Alpine on the board, or it also serves as a useful starting Alpine unit, as if you play this down in like turn 2, the enemy's not going to probably be able to remove it unless they have like some cheap blitz unit, which they don't have, which there aren't a lot of. And this makes it so you can build on other Alpines. But in general, it's not hard to get this to be like a 4/3, you know, like it's another great curve option with the 3rd Alpini. You know, you get an Alpini down, and then you get a 4/3 Gibrix Jaeger, which is hard to remove, so your other Alpines that you play afterwards are stronger, and a 4/3 is still just a big threat if the enemy has to trade into it. And it's not unrealistic for this card to be like a 5/4 or even like a 6/5. And once you start getting to that level, it just is insanely annoying to deal with, because Alpine is at that point probably already spamming the board full of really strong units, and just having some that can't be targeted by orders is just going to be such a back-breaking time. So it's just a really strong Alpine card. Then you have the 2nd Alpini Regiment. This is, again, another great curve option into the 3rd Alpine, as it is a... If you have any other Alpine, it is at least a 3/3 that draws you a card. And that's really nice. The fact that it draws you a card is really useful because it allows us to not have to worry as much about card draw within the deck, which is a legitimate concern on occasion. But this helps to alleviate that. You definitely want to not play this unless you can get the Alpine effect off. But seeing how it's so cheap and we have so many Alpine units, it's not hard to. But you definitely, unlike something like, say, the 141st, which you could play out as your first Alpine unit, you really... This is one of the few Alpine units that really feels bad to not activate Alpine with. Because that deployment effect is just really nice. But if you notice... These 3 cards, the 35, 141st, and 2nd Alpine, are all really good 2-drops that have strong game, that starts the game off very strong if you have a first Alpine. And that's actually, we'll talk about that in like when you mulligan, but there's definitely, the deck has a very strong start if you can get a first Alpine on turn 1 and the enemy doesn't remove it, which there aren't many ways to do that if you go first. Moving on from that, you have the Panzer III-L. This card doesn't really fit with much synergy within the deck, but it is a big blitz tank for cheap. It is not. This is very often going to be a 4/5 for 3 credits, which is just good. It's a very standard and easy to play card in most aggressive decks, and that's its purpose here. It gives you a little bit more burst, or just acts as a big 3-drop. Then we have a tech card, Breakthrough. Being able to dump guard, ambush, and smokescreen from units alongside the card draw is just actually quite useful. And the reason why is that at the moment there are a handful of top tier decks or really powerful decks that are often more so relying on guards to keep themselves safe, rather than large amounts of healing. And that's not to say that some decks don't have a lot of healing in them, but for example, stuff like Soviet value, they have some healing, but it's not like an infinite amount of it. It's not like they're not healing for 40 HP in a fight. At least not most variants. There are some that do that. But the more standard ones have a couple healing cards or maybe some incidental healing, but they largely rely on guards to really roadblock you. Stuff like the first rifles, the Seaforth Highlanders, the armored train, stuff like that gives them really strong guards to work with. And Breakthrough just negates that. And it can be actually more devastating than Blitzkrieg, which we do also have in the deck, because Blitzkrieg can sometimes force you to trade into guards in order to get to the HQ, while Breakthrough could allow you to occasionally just immediately smash the enemy HQ without having to trade. And the enemy now has a bunch of units that they can only trade with. And it's just a very nice card. But we only run one copy because, again, it's a tech card. It does replace itself with that draw card, which is really nice. That's like the one reason that it is like playable. But it keeps the deck, it gives the deck a little bit more card draw and a little bit more cycle, and the extra utility it gives, I think, is enough to warrant a slot. And granted, if you are running into decks that have lots of healing and not as many guards, Breakthrough should absolutely be removed and replaced with something else. It's a card, it's a tech card, if you feel like there's something else to replace it with, absolutely go ahead and do that. Moving on from that, we also have the FLAMMPANZER, and the FLAMMPANZER is just a very strong tool, namely very effective at combating aggro decks. It's not the best body in the world, but the ability to have a mini sudden strike as a deployment effect can help you reclaim control of the board, or at least put the enemy not so far ahead on it, which is very useful because there are occasions where aggro decks will get the better of us, whether we have like a clunky start or they manage to kill off some of our early Alpine units, and this is where FLAMMPANZER comes in to help kind of even the odds and give us some ability to combat while we slowly rebuild the Alpine board. So it's a very easy card. We run 2 copies because I ended up cutting one for the Breakthrough, which has proven useful, but if you don't like Breakthrough, you could always put in another FLAMMPANZER, or some other tank entirely. Next up, you have Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg is... There's not a lot to say about Blitzkrieg. It is a very... As I've said for almost every time I've talked about it, it's insanely good, and it will absolutely win you games. You don't need more than like 2 units in the front line for this to be really, really strong. That's +6 attack. That is a lot of damage. It's very, very strong, and it can just destroy people if they're unable to keep up with your board presence. And because of it, it is also notably useful in this deck because it allows our smaller Alpine units to be useful. For example, whatever first Alpine you play is oftentimes like something that is just on the board and not doing much. Blitzkrieg gives you a bit of room to make it useful by, giving it +3 attack. So even the smallest unit is going to be, a unit that attacks for 4. And then obviously on big units, it's just adding more insane damage onto the already massive units. and that just gives you a lot of flexibility and just ability to close games out, which is important for this deck. Beyond that, you also have the 136 Gibrix Jaeger. This was the card that came out during Legions that I think really helped the deck quite a lot. Being able to have just four additional Alpine units in the deck makes the Alpine game plan so much more consistent and just overall significantly better. It is definitely a bit slow, but it is not unreasonable for this guy to be like a 5. It is not hard for this guy to be like a 6/5 for 3 credits, which is really, really big. You know, he helps also smooth out the curve because he is a 3-credit Alpine unit, which we don't have a lot of. So it helps smooth out the curve later into the game, which is very, very nice. And beyond that, you also have just the fact that it is cheap to operate. That one operation cost is so nice. And if worse comes to worse, the 4/3 body on this guy is not always the easiest to remove. There definitely is a lot of removal that kills him, but he can be like your first Alpine unit, and you don't always feel awful about it. But that's definitely on the more desperate side. So you definitely do want Alpines to be on the board and to affect the various, to buff this guy up. And he's very good at receiving buffs and just beating people down. I would definitely say that, like, of the units that get going, this guy is often one of the most common, I find. Because you just play, like, your turn 1 3rd Alpine, and then you play any of the turn 2 Alpines, and then you play this guy, and he's a 6/5, and then the enemy just often doesn't have an answer for that. They just don't have a way to kill that. Following that up, we also have the OBICE DA75/13. I'm sure I just butchered that name, apologies. But regardless, this is an Alpine artillery unit, which is very unique. But the biggest thing is the fact that it gives your Alpine units fury until end of turn. This is essentially Blitzkrieg number 3 and 4 in the deck, while also adding more Alpine into the list. Being able to give even a single semi-buffed up Alpine unit fury is such incredible amounts of damage. You know, talking like the 136 Gibrix Jaeger, like as a 5/4, giving it fury means 10 damage to the enemy HQ, and that can absolutely kill it. And heaven forbid you have any amount of Alpine units that get fury and you blitzkrieg on the same turn. That absolutely ends the game. And in fact, that can probably kill people even if you just have a single Alpine unit. You know, one 136 Gibrix Jaeger alongside a Blitzkrieg and an OBICE, and the opponent's dead. You know, that's what, like 14 damage minimum, and it's not hard to do more than that. The OBICE is also, again, an artillery piece, so if you have any amount of decent artillery or Alpine, you know, if you have just like 2 Alpine out, then this is a 3/4 artillery piece for 3. That's quite powerful, and can help you lock down a board that is getting out of hand already. So it's a very effective tool, but it definitely does suffer from being like really reliant on Alpine, you know. And there is, I think, a good fair argument that maybe you only want to run 1 copy of this and maybe run something more impactful, because this isn't the greatest Alpine unit on its own, you know, unlike a lot of these other Alpine units where you really don't. It's a lot more like the second Alpine, but I would say even more extreme, because you really need like Alpine out on the board, and you want them in a position where they can attack with the fury, and you also want several Alpine out in order to really maximize this guy's effect. So I think there is maybe a fair argument to cut one of them, but I still think at least 1 copy is a good addition. Beyond that, you also have the BF 109E7 TROP, and this is essentially just a big unit. It is not very synergistic within the deck, outside of the fact that we run a fair mix of infantry and tanks, but a 4-credit 6/6 is good at killing people. Notably, this is really, really annoying for Soviet value to deal with, and this is one of the big reasons it's so good right now. Soviet value does not really run ways to deal with a big fighter. Unlike a lot of their tools are either only hitting ground units, or are so expensive that the trope coming down on turn 4 is just backbreaking. And as such, that's why we're running a few copies, because it's a very strong ace in the hole against Soviet value. It's not hard for this to be a 6-6, although you definitely do want a 6-6 to... You do want to make it a 6-6, you know? Like, there are times that you sometimes just got to play it out as a 4-4, but that really sucks, and it's not good. But if you can get it to a 6-6, then you're doing quite well. Beyond that, you also have the PANZER III-H. This is like another really standard German card, or German card in general. It is a card draw that lets you kind of pick what is best for the situation. The body's not great, although it is cheap in operation cost, so it can be useful with like Blitzkrieg. But really, it just helps us filter through our deck, find Alpine units, and just keeps us functioning. Then we have the 6th ALPINI Regiment, and this is a card that came out with Catalyst, or not Catalyst, it came out with Breakthrough, my apologies, and really hasn't seen, like, very few people talk about this, but this card is really useful as an Alpine unit. It is just outright the biggest Alpine unit in its base stats as a 3-5. It is not hard, and the guard on this card is really, really, really good. This deck doesn't have a lot of defensive measures, and the 6 Alpine, I cannot tell you how many times the Alpine just really does a good job by just guarding HQs, guarding key important units. Notably, this guy can be incredibly good at protecting a small Alpine unit and your HQ. And they're not going to want to run into this. You know, it's not hard for this guy to be a 4-6 or a 5-7. And that's massive. That's, just for reference, Seaforth Highlanders is a 4-credit 1-7. And when it's on the enemy turns, it's a 4-7. So if you have one Alpine unit out, you get -1 health on this guy, but you permanently have the 4 attack. Like, that is... like, really, really good. And if you get even just 2 Alpines out, this is literally just a better Seaforth Highlanders. And by turn 4, it's not that difficult to get it out. Or if you're really late into the game, you can always just play out, you know, 2 or 3 Alpines at once. But this is just a card that doesn't get talked a lot about, but I think is a really nice, like, late game power card for Alpine, giving them obviously more Alpine, but more oomph in their late game, because while also defending, it's very well rounded. It is a bit slow, absolutely, and if it does get bounced, that definitely hurts, but it also is just so resilient, and is just very difficult for players to remove until like late game, where hard removal is really common. Beyond that, you also have the JAGDBOMBER. This is a very basic card. The JAGDBOMBER has cemented itself as a card you practically just run in every German deck. It's just a really good 5-drop. You bounce anything, any ground unit, you know, whether that's like a buffed up, you know, unit or an annoying artillery piece or a guard, and you get a 5-4 on top of it. There's not a whole lot to say. It's just really good. Then you have the PANZER IV F2. The PANZER IV F2 is a card that a year ago probably was arguably just like one of the best German cards, and since then it definitely doesn't see as much use, at least not in high level competitive. But for the Alpine deck, it's a very nice kind of top end card. Being able to bounce an enemy unit is really nice, whether that's a guard or again an artillery piece, and you can essentially see them as slightly weaker Focke-Wulf 190s. It definitely is worse against units in the front line, but this deck can have a good chance of taking the front line, because once it gets the front line, it's very good at holding on to it. And the Panzer IV just adds extra threats and also some extra removal. And then the final card is the Leopold. The Leopold is just... It's in here because sometimes the game can drag out, and the Leopold can help with giving you a last burst chance. Obviously it's a board clear with a big artillery piece on it, and that is sometimes just good enough. And the Leopold is able to sometimes close games out, or just put the enemy on such a back foot that they're not able to recover. But it's definitely in here more so as a last-ditch attempt to try to snatch a win out of the game. If you've been pushed back and haven't been able to finish the game, sometimes Leopold can give you just the brief moment of rest that you need, and then you can rebuild your Alpine board and then maybe pull out a win. So that is the deck. And in terms of Mulligan, the 3rd Alpini Regiment is definitely the card you're looking for the most. You almost always are just wanting to play this on turn 1 because you want to get your Alpine chain going as much as possible. This is probably the most important card within it. After you have a 3rd Alpini Regiment, I would recommend taking one of the 2-drops. Any of them are good. Yeah, just any of them are really good. You definitely... So, 3rd Alpini is the #1 important, then a 2-drop, and then you probably should just keep looking for more Alpine units. Stuff like the 136 or more of the 2-drops. It can also be said that if you know what the enemy's playing, sometimes it's a good idea to keep removal. Like if you're playing against someone and you know that they're playing aggro, FLAMMPANZER's not a bad keep. Neither is a single joint operation. But I would definitely say your main game plan is find the 3rd Alpini Regiment, play out another, and then get your Alpine chain going. And then as you go into the mid-game, you just want to keep playing big units at a rate hopefully faster than the enemy can answer it, and then beat them to death. Now that I'm thinking about it a bit more, let me just alter this deck list a little bit. We're going to take out one OBICE DA in favor of a 4th, 6th Alpini. I think this will probably be a little more effective because the OBICE is really good, but the 6th Alpini is a bit better of an Alpine unit on its own, and I've already talked about how I think it's really good. So there we go. Slightly adjusted the list a little bit. So beyond that, you could also consider a few other cards in the deck. Let's start off with Italy. La Decima is a very effective removal card that also has cheap guard. It is not very synergistic within the archetype, and you're going to have to take out an Alpine card, which hurts. But it is very powerful at beefing up your late game by being able to remove stuff that you otherwise wouldn't be able to answer. So that could actually be... So that could be a very effective option. I don't know if I'd run 2 copies. I don't know if you can really afford cutting it, but you could always cut a 6th Alpini for a La Decima. Or maybe you can just forego the Obise altogether and put a La Decima in, and beef up your late game. I definitely think that Alpine, even though it seems like a very aggressive archetype, can actually play a decent mid to late game. But you definitely got to lean into it a little bit more with stuff like La Decima and a few other big cards. But it's not impossible because Alpine is very good at also just playing a bit more of a slow game and just continually building up massive Alpine units, or saving a handful of Alpines and then playing them all at once so the board is instantly super terrifying. But that is a little bit beyond the scope of this. On top of that, other cards, the 158 Nakshub, if you wanted to, instead of going into a slower option, go into a faster option, the 158 is one of the better options to include, as you'd be able to better enfranchise on any early lead you get. If you use trade with one of your moderate-sized Alpine units, then you can Nakshub and then get more Alpine units out. That is definitely a strategy. And probably should, and it is very close to being within the deck. But we do lack, but the deck can be a bit slow. We don't have as many blitz units or units with deployment effects outside of something like the 3L or the FLAMMPANZER, which does make this a bit more awkward to use. But it can definitely be very explosive. So if you feel like putting this in, could be a good replacement for Breakthrough. Again, if Breakthrough is not to your suiting or not, or the meta is turning away from a lot of guards, could be a good option. Beyond that, you also have, where is it? The Heinkel HE115. This card wouldn't have a lot of synergy within the deck, but it's a cheap threat that is going to give you extra card draw. And that can just be effective enough on occasion. You can also look to include encirclement. This would give you 2 more Alpine units, and that is there's definitely a good argument for encirclement being within the deck, but it is a bit clunky. Like, if I were to do that, I'd probably end up cutting, like, some of the more clunky cards, like Breakthrough and things like the OBICE in favor of them. But encirclement is clunky on its own. It's definitely like one of the slower. When it starts going off, it is incredibly powerful, but it is slow to get there because you need to play out an Alpine unit. You need to probably have a few Alpine units out. You need to get a big one into the front line. Then you need to copy it, and then finally you have the payoff from encirclement. And with the addition of the 136, it became much less important to have this because you now have like a good critical mass of Alpines. So if you really want to go all in, encirclement is an option, but I personally wouldn't. You also have stuff like the Nebelwerfer. This would be a similar thing to the FLAMMPANZER, but in a different manner. I probably wouldn't cut FLAMMPANZERs for the Nebels because you don't want the artilleries. If you're running the BF-109, you want the tanks. So if you cut any tanks from this deck and still want to use the 109s, I would recommend replacing a tank with a tank. Which does lead into the question of the 38T. And the 38T gives you, trades away speed in favor of resilience. Again, they're pretty much just smaller 3Hs. And that's not bad, but it's definitely not amazing either. And as such, it can be a bit awkward to make use of, especially if you get on the back foot. There is also this one, the Stug 3G Scritchen. I just butchered that also. Again, apologies. And this does seem like a weird card, and I don't see anybody talk about this, but it's not a bad aggressive unit. If you want to put the more pressure on the enemy, this is honestly one of the best 3-drops out there. It's a cheap operation cost, it's a relatively well-statted body, and that pincer with heavy armor is not bad. It makes certain Alpine units really annoying to deal with. Something like the Gibrix Jaeger with heavy armor, and it's like a 5/4, is like so annoying to deal with. You know, so if you want to lean into a more aggressive play, then maybe you could cut FLAMMPANZERs and put in these. It's an option. You're definitely leaving yourself vulnerable to aggro decks, though. Beyond that, though, I believe that is most of what it is, outside of the Comet. The Comet is a win con for the deck, and if you feel like you need more burst or late game power, it's very easy to possibly cut something like a Panzer IV in favor of a Comet, you know. In fact, we can even just do that. I'll leave this in the deck list. But if you feel like, if you don't have the Comet or feel like the Comet is too ineffective, a 4H can always replace it. And that is pretty much it. So that is the deck tech. I wanna, it's important to note that this deck is not like a top tier deck, and there's definitely a bit of a learning curve to it. Most notably, against Soviet value, you gotta kind of play in a really weird way in order to maximize it. Confusion can be backbreaking if you try to rely on just big Alpine units. Instead, really, against Soviet value, you want to try to just get down the 109 real quick and kill them with that, or swarm the board with cheap units, and then Blitzkrieg. Both of those can be effective, but you don't want to, like, don't try to lead into their confusion. Confusion's one of the biggest things against this deck, but thankfully, this is why stuff like the 6th Alpini Regiment is useful. It's very big, very hard for them to remove. They can't confusion it. They can't even, like, hammer it, you know, and that's why 6th Alpini is, like, so good. And then again, the 109 is again similar. But obviously, if you feel as though the deck needs a bit more adjustment, you can obviously do that. I've already gone over that. And otherwise, I think that's about it. So thank you all so much for watching. As I said before, sorry about the sorry about a sort of delay that happened with the videos, but hopefully I can get back on the regular schedule I'm trying to keep to, of 2 videos a week. So expect one later this week. Maybe it'll be over cards, or maybe it'll be over a game like Company of Heroes 3. Let me know which one you come here for. Are you interested at all in Company of Heroes 3, or do you just come here for cards? And otherwise, just make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're not subscribed, make sure to subscribe, so you can get more updates about the various deck techs and all the changes going on within cards. And then also make sure to like this video. It helps out. We are still on the small side, but that's definitely, but within 1 month I've reached almost 100 subscribers, which is just incredible. And I'm glad so many people enjoy and find use from these deck techs. So with that said, I want to thank you for watching, and have a good day.